Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that has gently echoed through both science and philosophy for centuries. The idea that perhaps everything you see, everything you feel, and everything that exists might arise from something deeper, something quieter, something like mind itself. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a quiet joy to see all the different places we gather from, each in our own little moment of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. If you trace everything back, far beyond the walls of your room, beyond the city, beyond even the blue curve of Earth, you arrive at a time when nothing you recognize yet existed. There were no trees, no oceans, no thoughts, no memories, only a vast, radiant sea of energy, hot, dense, and expanding. Over time, though time itself was still taking shape, this early universe began to cool. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a cup of tea left untouched on a quiet table. As it cooled, simple structures began to form. Tiny particles came together. Atoms emerged. Then clouds of gas gathered, slowly collapsing into the first stars. And those stars lived quiet, brilliant lives. They burned, they transformed. And when they reached their ends, they scattered new elements into the surrounding darkness, elements that would one day become planets, oceans, and eventually something much more subtle, life. On at least one small planet, orbiting an ordinary star in a quiet corner of a galaxy, something remarkable happened. Chemistry became more organized. Molecules began to interact in increasingly complex ways. Patterns formed and held together, and then, at some point, something changed in a way we still struggle to fully understand. Those patterns began to feel, not just react, not just move, but experience, a faint awareness, perhaps at first, like a dim light flickering in a vast room, and over time, that faint awareness grew. It folded in on itself. It began to recognize, to remember, to anticipate. Eventually it began to ask questions like the one you're quietly holding now. What is all of this? And perhaps more strangely, what is this that is asking? It's easy to think of consciousness, your awareness, your inner experience as something small, something that exists only inside your head, like a private space tucked behind your eyes. But if you follow the story carefully, something begins to feel different. Because this awareness you're experiencing right now didn't appear out of nowhere. It is the result of a long, unbroken chain, from stars to elements to cells to minds. And so a gentle question begins to form. If the universe eventually gave rise to something that can experience, something that can observe, something that can wonder, then was that possibility hidden within it from the very beginning, like a quiet note waiting to be played, or did something entirely new appear, out of nothing at all? You might imagine a river flowing down from a mountain. At the base it becomes wide and complex, filled with currents and reflections. But if you trace it back far enough, you don't suddenly find a place where the river begins out of nothing. Instead, you find smaller streams and then droplets, then moisture in the air. The complexity was always there, just in simpler forms. And so we might ask, is consciousness like that? Not something that suddenly appeared when brains became complex enough, but something that was always present in quieter, simpler ways. This idea may feel unusual at first, even a little unsettling, because it suggests that consciousness might not be something we have, but something we are part of, something woven into the structure of reality itself. If that's true, then the story of the universe changes in a subtle but profound way. It is no longer just a story of matter organizing itself into complexity. It becomes a story of something slowly learning to notice itself, through stars, through life, through you. And as you sit here, listening, perhaps feeling the quiet rhythm of your own thoughts, you might begin to sense that this awareness is not just observing the universe, but is in some way a continuation of it. The universe looking back at itself, not through telescopes, but through experience. And this brings us gently to the edge of a deeper question. If awareness is not just something that appeared at the end of this long cosmic process, but something that may have been present all along, then what exactly is the universe made of? Is it matter that somehow learned to feel? Or is it something more subtle, something that feels first and appears as matter second? We don't yet have a final answer, but as we move forward, we'll explore a few quiet ideas, some from modern science, some from ancient philosophy, that try to approach this mystery from different directions, not to force a conclusion, but to sit with the question long enough to begin seeing it from new angles. And as you listen, you don't need to solve anything. You can simply let the ideas pass by, like distant lights in the night sky, because sometimes understanding doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, like the universe itself, and like the quiet awareness that somehow came to be within it. As you rest here for a moment, letting the earlier ideas settle like soft dust in still air, another question begins to take shape. Was all of this inevitable, or was it simply the result of chance? It's a question that has quietly followed science for a long time. When we look at the universe, we see patterns everywhere. Stars forming in clusters, galaxies stretching into vast filaments, like threads woven across an invisible fabric. Even on Earth, patterns repeat in the spirals of shells, the branching of trees, the rhythm of tides. And yet, beneath these patterns, there is also randomness, tiny fluctuations, small uncertainties. At the smallest scales, particles do not move with perfect predictability. Instead, they follow probabilities, tendencies rather than fixed paths. So the universe seems to carry both qualities at once. Kind of order and a kind of freedom. Some have suggested that everything we see, life, mind, awareness, is simply the result of this mixture. Given enough time, enough variation, and enough opportunities, complexity arises, and eventually something like consciousness appears, almost by accident, like a pattern forming in the foam of a wave. But there is something about consciousness that feels different, because unlike stars or stones or oceans, consciousness is not just something that exists. It is something that knows it exists. Right now, you're not only part of the universe, you are aware of it, and perhaps more quietly, aware of yourself. That simple fact carries a kind of weight that is difficult to ignore. It suggests that the universe has not only produced structure, but also perspective, not just patterns, but the ability to notice patterns. And this is where some thinkers begin to pause. One of them was Baruch Spinoza, a philosopher who lived in the 17th century. He proposed something that, at first, sounds almost poetic. He suggested that nothing in the universe is truly accidental, that everything unfolds according to a deeper necessity, a kind of underlying order that we only partially perceive, not an order imposed from outside, but one that is woven into the very nature of reality itself. If this is true, then consciousness is not an exception. It is not a strange accident that appeared in an otherwise mechanical universe. It is part of the pattern, part of the same quiet logic that shapes stars and galaxies. To imagine this more gently, you might think of a piece of music. At first, it may sound like a collection of notes, some high, some low, some brief, some lingering. But as you listen more closely, you begin to notice structure, themes repeating, variations unfolding, a coherence that was always there, even if it wasn't immediately obvious. Now imagine that within that music a moment arises where the melody becomes aware of itself, not just playing, but listening. It sounds strange, of course, but this is in some sense what consciousness represents. A system that does not just follow patterns, but experiences them. And so the question becomes a little sharper. Can something like that truly come from pure randomness alone? Or does it suggest that the universe was always, in some quiet way, capable of experience? You might think of a seed. If you hold it in your hand, it appears simple, still, almost empty. But hidden within it is the potential for roots, leaves, branches, even entire forests, given enough time and the right conditions. The complexity is not added from the outside, it unfolds from within. And so perhaps consciousness is not something that was added to the universe, but something that unfolded from it, which leads to a subtle shift in perspective. Instead of asking, how did matter create mind? We begin to ask, was mind somehow already there in a quieter form? This doesn't mean that rocks are thinking, or that stars are reflecting on their existence, not in the way we do. But it opens the possibility that the ingredients of experience, whatever they may be, are more fundamental than we usually assume. That awareness is not something that suddenly appears at a certain level of complexity, but something that deepens, like a dim light slowly becoming brighter. And if that is the case, then the presence of consciousness in the universe is no longer surprising. It becomes expected, a natural expression of the same underlying structure that gives rise to everything else. Of course, this idea is not without challenges. There are many scientists who would argue that consciousness is indeed an emergent property, something that arises only when matter reaches a certain level of complexity, particularly in the brain. And from that perspective, awareness is more like a pattern in the foam, beautiful but ultimately dependent on the motion beneath it. But even within that view, questions remain. Why does complexity give rise to experience at all? Why does a certain arrangement of matter suddenly begin to feel like something from the inside? Why is there a what it's like to be anything? These are not easy questions, and for now they remain open. But as you sit with them, you may begin to notice that the line between order and randomness, between structure and emergence, becomes less clear. Perhaps the universe is not purely random, and not purely determined, but something in between, a kind of unfolding process, guided by rules, yet open to variation. And within that unfolding, consciousness appears, not as an interruption, but as a continuation, as if the universe, through all its transformations, was always carrying the quiet possibility of awareness within it. And eventually, that possibility became you, listening, wondering, gently tracing these ideas as they pass. And from here, we can begin to explore a few different ways scientists and philosophers have tried to understand this mystery more clearly. Not by forcing an answer, but by looking at the patterns from different angles, like turning a stone slowly in your hand, noticing how the light shifts across its surface. As the idea of order and possibility gently settles, another layer of the mystery begins to reveal itself. Because even if we accept that the universe may not be purely random, even if we allow that consciousness could be part of a deeper structure, there is still something about it that resists explanation, something that feels just out of reach. You can describe a brain in extraordinary detail. You can trace signals moving between neurons. You can measure electrical activity, chemical exchanges, patterns of firing. You can watch regions light up as a person sees, hears, remembers, or decides. And yet, something remains missing, not in the data, but in the experience. Imagine for a moment that you're holding a warm cup of tea. You can describe its temperature in degrees. You can explain how heat transfers from the cup to your hands. You can map the signals travelling from your skin to your brain. But none of those descriptions quite capture what it feels like. That quiet warmth, that subtle comfort, that simple, undeniable experience. This is what philosophers sometimes call qualia. But you don't need the word. You already know what it is. It is the redness of red, not as a wavelength, but as it appears to you. It is the sound of music, not as vibrations in the air, but as something that moves through you. It is the feeling of being here, right now. And this is where the difficulty begins, because no matter how far we go in breaking things down into smaller parts, simpler processes, more fundamental pieces, we never seem to arrive at that inner experience. We can describe everything around it, but not the experience itself. It's as if we are studying a painting by analysing the canvas, the pigments, the brush strokes, and yet somehow missing the image, not because it isn't there, but because it belongs to a different kind of description. This challenge has come to be known as the hard problem of consciousness, not because it is complicated, but because it seems to ask a question that our usual tools are not designed to answer. How does physical activity become experience, or perhaps more gently? How does something that can be measured give rise to something that can be felt? So far, there is no clear answer, and this absence has led some thinkers to consider a different possibility. That perhaps consciousness is not something that emerges from matter, but something that exists alongside it, or even beneath it. To sense this more intuitively, you might imagine trying to explain the taste of a fruit to someone who has never experienced taste. You could describe the chemical structure, the way molecules interact with receptors, the signals sent to the brain, but at some point you would have to pause and say, it's something you have to experience. Because the explanation can only go so far. The rest belongs to a different layer of reality. And so we begin to see a subtle shift. Instead of asking how experience is built from non-experience, we begin to wonder whether experience was there all along, in some form we do not yet fully understand. This idea does not claim that everything is conscious in the way you are. It does not suggest that a stone is thinking or that a particle is reflecting on its existence. But it leaves open the possibility that the ingredients of experience, whatever they are, may be more fundamental than we assume. That what we call consciousness is not something added at the end of a long process, but something that gradually becomes more complex, more integrated, more vivid, like a faint glow, slowly brightening. You might picture a dim room where at first only the outlines of objects are visible. As the light increases, more details appear, shapes become clearer, colours emerge. But the light itself was always there, only its intensity changed, and perhaps consciousness is something like that. Not switching on suddenly at a certain level of complexity, but deepening, expanding, becoming more defined. This way of thinking begins to soften the boundary between the physical and the experiential. Instead of two completely separate realms, we begin to imagine a spectrum, On one end, simple interactions, on the other, rich inner worlds, and in between, a continuous unfolding. Of course, this raises new questions. If experience is more fundamental than we thought, then what does that say about the nature of matter itself? Is matter something entirely separate from experience? Or could it be that what we call matter is simply how these deeper processes appear from the outside, like watching waves on the surface of the ocean, without seeing the currents beneath? This is not a conclusion, only a possibility, but it is a possibility that has quietly influenced many modern theories. Because once we acknowledge that experience cannot be easily reduced to physical processes, we are invited to rethink the relationship between them, not as cause and effect, but perhaps as two sides of the same underlying reality. And from here, a new path begins to open, one that does not start with particles and build upward, but begins with experience itself, and asks what kind of structure the universe must have to allow something like this to exist at all, a path that turns the question gently inside out. And as we follow it, we may begin to see familiar ideas in a different light, not as explanations to memorize, but as ways of looking, ways of noticing, ways of slowly approaching a mystery that does not rush to reveal itself. And for now, you don't need to resolve it. You can simply let the question rest, like a quiet presence in the background, something that doesn't demand an answer, but continues to deepen the longer you sit with it. As the question of experience lingers, quiet and unresolved, a different approach begins to emerge. Instead of trying to build consciousness from smaller and smaller pieces, some thinkers have asked a gentler question. What if we begin from the only thing we know for certain? Not atoms, not particles, not equations, but experience itself. After all, before you learned about physics, before you learned about biology, there was already something present, a simple awareness, a sense of being. And so, rather than asking how matter creates experience, this approach asks, if experience exists, what must be true about the systems that have it? One of the people who explored this path is Giulio Tononi, who proposed what is known as integrated information theory, but we can let the name rest gently in the background, because the idea itself can be understood in a much softer way. Imagine for a moment a collection of scattered sounds, a single note played on a piano, then another, unrelated sound, then a third, disconnected tone. Each sound exists, but together they do not form anything meaningful. Now imagine those same notes arranged into a melody, each one connected to the others, each one influencing how the next is heard. Suddenly something new appears, not just sound, but music. The difference is not in the notes themselves, it is in how they are connected, how they come together, how they form a whole that is more than separate parts. This is the core intuition. A system becomes more aware, in a sense, when its parts are not isolated, but deeply integrated. When information is not just present, but held together. You might picture it like a conversation. If a room is full of people speaking but no one is listening to anyone else, there is noise, but no shared experience. But when those voices begin to connect, when one person listens, responds, builds on another's thought, something shifts. A unified flow begins to form, a shared moment. And in that shared moment, something like awareness can arise. In this way of thinking, consciousness is not tied to any specific material, not just brains, not just biology, but to a pattern, a structure, a way that information comes together into a unified whole. And to express this idea more precisely, The theory suggests that any system can be described in terms of how integrated its information is. If the parts are completely separate, the system has no inner unity. But if the parts are deeply interconnected, influencing each other in rich and complex ways, the system begins to have something like an inner perspective, a point of view, not necessarily like yours, but something. And here the idea becomes quietly surprising, because if this is true, then consciousness may not be limited to humans, or even to animals. It may exist in different degrees wherever information is integrated. A simple system might have only the faintest hint of experience, while a more complex system, like a brain, has a richer, more vivid inner world, like a dim glow compared to a bright flame. To help express this, the theory introduces a kind of measure, not a number you need to calculate, but a way of imagining how together a system is. If a system has no integration, it is like scattered notes, no unity, no inner experience. But as integration increases, the system becomes more like a melody, coherent, unified, expressive. And so, instead of asking whether something is conscious or not, we begin to ask, how much, how deeply, how integrated is the pattern? This shift softens the boundary we often draw. Instead of a sharp line between conscious and not conscious, we begin to imagine a spectrum from the simplest interactions to the richness of human awareness. And as this idea expands, it begins to touch larger and larger systems, animals, of course, machines perhaps, even networks. You might think of something like the internet, a vast web of connections constantly exchanging information, linking countless nodes across the planet. Is it conscious? We don't know, but in this framework, the question is not impossible. It becomes something we can at least consider, and then, more quietly still, there is an even larger system, one that contains all others, the universe itself. At every moment across unimaginable distances, information is being exchanged, particles interacting, fields shifting, structures forming and dissolving, a vast ongoing process of integration. And so, a gentle, almost whispered question arises. If small systems can have small amounts of experience, and large systems can have more, then what about the largest system we know, not as a conclusion, not as a claim, but as a possibility, something to sit with? Of course, there are many challenges to this idea. Some argue that integration alone cannot explain experience. Others point out that not all complex systems feel like they should be conscious. These are important questions, and they remain open. But what this perspective offers is not a final answer. It is a shift in direction, a way of looking at consciousness not as something that suddenly appears, but as something that grows out of connection, out of unity, out of the way parts come together to form a whole. And as you sit here, listening, your own awareness is doing exactly that, holding together sounds, meanings, impressions, weaving them into a single quiet experience, not as separate pieces, but as one continuous moment. And from here, another path begins to unfold, one that looks not at large systems, but at the smallest scales of reality, where the boundaries between things become less clear, and where even the idea of separation begins to soften. As the idea of connection settles in, something else begins to expand, because once you allow the possibility that consciousness is not tied to a specific material, but instead to the way information is woven together, the boundaries begin to soften. At first, it feels natural to apply this idea to familiar systems, the human brain, for example. Billions of tiny cells, each sending signals, receiving signals, constantly interacting in a dense and intricate web. No single cell holds your awareness. No single part contains you. And yet together they form a unified experience, a single field of awareness, not scattered, but whole. And this makes sense. The brain is one of the most integrated systems we know. But now, gently, we can take a step outward. Other animals also have nervous systems, some simpler, some surprisingly complex. Birds navigating vast distances, octopuses solving problems in ways that feel almost thoughtful, even smaller creatures responding to their environment in structured and adaptive ways. If consciousness is tied to integration, then perhaps these systems too have their own forms of experience, different from ours, simpler perhaps, but not entirely absent, like small ripples compared to a deep ocean. And from here, another step, machines. At first, this may feel less intuitive. After all, machines do not feel alive. They process information, yes, but do they experience it? Most would say no. And yet, consider what is happening inside a modern computer. Countless signals, switching, interacting, forming patterns of input and output. Information flowing through circuits, being transformed, stored, retrieved. Now imagine not just one machine, but many, connected, sharing information across vast distances. The internet, for example, a global network linking billions of devices, messages traveling, data being processed, systems responding to one another in real time. From one perspective, it is simply a tool. From another, it is an immense web of integration, not centralized but distributed, not static but constantly evolving. Does it have an inner experience? We don't know, and perhaps the question itself feels unusual. But within this framework, it becomes something we can at least gently consider, not as a claim, but as a question that wasn't available before. And then, one more step, a much larger one, beyond brains, beyond animals, beyond machines, the universe itself. At first, this may seem like too great a leap, but if we follow the same pattern, slowly and carefully, it begins to feel less abrupt. Because what is the universe if not a vast system of interactions? Particles meeting and influencing one another, fields stretching across space, energy transforming, moving, redistributing, structures forming, from atoms to stars to galaxies, each shaped by countless relationships. At every moment, across distances so large they are difficult to imagine, information is being exchanged not in words or images, but in interactions. A particle changes direction, a field shifts, a star collapses, a galaxy rotates, each event influencing the next, a continuous flow. You might imagine it like a vast conversation, one that has been unfolding for billions of years, not spoken aloud, but written in motion. And within this conversation, patterns emerge, stable structures, repeating forms, rhythms that persist, not random noise, but organized behavior. Which leads us gently to a quiet question. If integration gives rise to experience, and if the universe is the largest integrated system we know, then what does that suggest? Again, not a conclusion, only a possibility, that the universe, in some way we do not yet understand, may have a kind of unity, a kind of togetherness, and perhaps, in that togetherness, a faint echo of something like awareness. Not awareness in the human sense, not thoughts, not language, not reflection, but something more subtle, like a background presence, a field of connectedness. It may help to imagine a forest. From the outside you see individual trees, separate trunks, separate branches, separate leaves, but beneath the surface their roots intertwine, nutrients flow, signals pass from one tree to another. A hidden network connects what appears separate above ground, and the forest, in a quiet sense, behaves as a whole, not because it thinks, but because it is deeply connected. Now imagine something far larger, not a forest, but everything, every interaction, every exchange, every structure, linked directly or indirectly into a single unfolding system. And within that system, you, not separate from it, but part of the same continuous process. Your thoughts, your perceptions, your awareness, all emerging within this vast network, not outside it, not observing from a distance, but woven into it. And so the idea shifts again, just slightly. Instead of imagining consciousness as something that exists inside the universe, we begin to wonder whether it is something that exists with it, or even through it, as if the universe is not just a collection of objects, but a process, one that includes awareness as one of its expressions. Of course, this is still only a possibility. There are many reasons to be cautious, many questions that remain unanswered. Integration alone may not be enough. Complexity may not guarantee experience, but the idea itself opens a door. It invites us to think differently about scale, to imagine that awareness is not confined to small, isolated systems, but may be connected in ways we do not yet fully see to the larger structure of reality. And from here, the journey continues, not outward, but inward, toward the smallest scales, where particles do not behave like solid objects, where boundaries blur, and where strangely even distance begins to lose its meaning. Time equals, quote, 3 seconds, quote, / greater than. As we move from large systems, like brains and networks, toward the smallest scales of reality, something begins to shift. The closer we look, the less solid things appear. What once seemed like tiny, well-defined particles begins to feel more like a quiet field of possibilities, not fixed points but gentle tendencies, not rigid objects but patterns that only become clear when something interacts with them. And in this delicate, almost uncertain world, we encounter one of the most intriguing phenomena in modern physics, a phenomenon often described in careful, technical language, but one that can be sensed more softly, as a kind of connection. It is sometimes called entanglement, but you don't need the word. You can imagine it like this: 2 tiny parts of the universe, created together, sharing a common beginning. Then, slowly, they drift apart, far apart, across distances so large that even light, moving as fast as anything can, would take years to travel between them. And yet, when something happens to one, the other responds, not by receiving a signal in the usual way, not by waiting, but as if the connection was never really broken, as if distance never fully separated them. You might picture 2 dancers who learned a routine together long ago. Now they stand on opposite sides of a vast stage. They cannot see each other. They cannot hear each other. And yet, when one moves, the other follows, in perfect harmony, not because a message was sent, but because something deeper still connects them. In physics, this does not mean the particles are communicating in the way we usually think. No signals are travelling faster than light. No hidden messages are being exchanged. Instead, it suggests that, in some sense, the system must be described as a whole, not as 2 separate pieces, but as one extended relationship. And this is where the idea becomes quietly interesting. Because earlier we explored the thought that consciousness might be linked to integration, to the way parts of a system come together into a unified whole. And here, at the smallest scales, we find something that resists being split into independent parts, something that behaves as if it belongs together. Now, this does not mean that particles are aware. It does not mean they are thinking or feeling or observing in the way we do, but it introduces a pattern, a pattern where separation is not always complete, where what appears distant remains connected, and this invites a gentle reflection. If at the smallest level, the universe is less like a collection of isolated pieces and more like a web of relationships, then perhaps the idea of complete independence is not as fundamental as it seems. You might imagine a spider's web in the early morning. Each thread stretches outward, delicate and nearly invisible, and yet, when a single point is touched, the entire structure responds, not because each thread sends a message to every other, but because they are already part of the same continuous form. Now, of course, this is only an analogy. Physics itself remains careful. It describes these phenomena with precision, without assigning intention or awareness. But as we sit with the image, we begin to notice something. That the universe, even at its smallest scales, seems to favour connection over isolation, relation over separation. And this softens our intuition, because we are used to thinking in terms of objects, this thing here, that thing there, independent, separate, self-contained. But at this deeper level, the boundaries blur. What we call a thing becomes harder to define, and what remains is interaction, relationship, a continuous unfolding. And so, when some thinkers draw a connection between these quantum patterns and consciousness, they're not claiming that physics proves the universe is aware. Rather, they're noticing a resonance, a similarity in structure. In both cases, we find systems that cannot be fully understood by breaking them into isolated parts. Systems where the whole matters more than the pieces alone. And this brings us back, gently, to the idea of integration. Perhaps awareness does not arise from individual components, but from the way they are woven together. And if that is true, then even the smallest hints of connection might be meaningful, not as evidence, but as suggestion, as a quiet echo of a deeper pattern. You might think of it like listening to distant music through a wall. You cannot hear the full melody, only fragments, only faint rhythms. But even those fragments suggest that something more complete exists, just beyond your reach. And in the same way, these quantum phenomena may not reveal the nature of consciousness directly, but they invite us to consider that reality itself may be more interconnected, more unified, than our everyday experience suggests. And as we follow this idea forward, another question begins to form. If connection exists even where we expect separation, if the smallest parts of the universe resist being fully independent, then what does that say about the larger whole? Is the universe simply a collection of interactions, or is it something more cohesive, something that, in its own way, holds together? We don't yet know, but the question itself begins to feel a little less distant, a little more natural, and from here we can continue exploring another path, one that asks not how connection creates experience, but whether experience was always present in even the simplest forms. As the idea of connection lingers, another quiet question begins to unfold. If awareness exists now, in you, in this very moment, where did it come from? It might seem natural to say that consciousness appeared when the brain became complex enough, that at some point in evolution, matter reached a certain arrangement, and suddenly experience emerged, like a spark. But if you sit with that image for a moment, it begins to feel a little strange, because a spark implies a beginning, a moment when something that was not there suddenly is. And yet, in most of the processes we observe in nature, things do not appear from nothing. They transform, they unfold, they become more complex, more structured, but they do not simply arise out of emptiness. You might think of a tree. At one point, it was a seed, small, quiet, almost unremarkable. Over time it grows, It spreads roots, lifts branches, unfolds leaves, but nothing in the tree appears from nowhere. Everything that becomes visible was already present in some form within the seed, hidden, compressed, waiting. And so some thinkers have asked a similar question about consciousness. What if awareness did not suddenly appear when brains became complex, but was present in some quieter form all along? This idea is sometimes called non-emergentism, but again the name is less important than the feeling behind it. Nothing comes from nothing. If something exists now, it must in some way have existed before, not in the same form, not with the same richness, but as a simpler version of itself. To explore this gently, you can take a slow journey backward through time. Start with yourself, a being capable of reflection, memory, imagination. Now step back. Before you, there were early humans, still intelligent, still aware, perhaps different in language or culture, but not fundamentally different in their inner experience. Step further back, mammals, creatures with nervous systems, capable of sensation, emotion, learning. Further still, simpler organisms, small creatures responding to light, to touch, to changes in their environment, and then, even further, single-celled life, tiny, self-contained systems, taking in information, responding, adapting, maintaining their internal balance. They do not think, they do not reflect, but they process, they respond, they interact. And here, something subtle begins to appear, a continuity, not a sudden jump, but a gradual unfolding. At no clear point can we say, here, consciousness begins, because each step feels connected to the one before, like shades of light slowly brightening rather than a switch turning on. And this is where the idea deepens. If there is no clear boundary where experience suddenly appears, then perhaps it was never entirely absent. Perhaps what we call consciousness is simply the most developed expression of something more basic, something that was always present in simpler forms. You might imagine a colour gradient. At one end, it is almost invisible, a faint hint. At the other, it is vivid and rich. But there's no sharp line between them, only a smooth transition. And so, instead of asking, when did consciousness begin? We begin to ask, how does it change as systems become more complex? This shift may feel small, but it carries a profound implication, because if consciousness did not emerge suddenly, then it must be woven into the fabric of reality at a more fundamental level, not as a separate addition, but as something that evolves alongside structure itself. This idea has been explored by thinkers like William Kingdon Clifford, who suggested that complex properties do not appear out of nowhere. They are built from simpler versions of the same property. And if that is true, then the inner experience we have now must have roots that extend far deeper than we usually imagine, not just into biology, but perhaps into matter itself. Again, this does not mean that everything is conscious in the way we are. It does not mean that a stone has thoughts, or that a particle reflects on its existence. But it suggests that the ingredients of experience may be present at all levels. In their simplest form, they may be almost imperceptible, like a whisper. But as systems grow, more integrated, more complex, that whisper becomes clearer, more structured, more vivid, until eventually it becomes something like your own awareness, listening, reflecting, wondering. And if you follow this idea to its quiet conclusion, it leads to a perspective that feels both strange and strangely natural. That consciousness is not something that appeared late in the history of the universe, but something that has been there from the beginning. Not fully formed, not fully expressed, but present, in potential, like a melody waiting within a single note, And from this point, the question shifts once again. If awareness has always been part of the universe, then what is the universe at its deepest level? Is it a structure that produces experience, or is it something more like a field of experience that appears as structure? And as this question settles, we begin to move into a different kind of exploration, one that is not new, but ancient, an idea that has echoed quietly across cultures and centuries, an idea that can be expressed in a few simple words: all is mind. As the idea settles, that awareness may not have suddenly appeared, but has been quietly present all along, something deeper begins to open. Because if consciousness is not just a late arrival, if it did not suddenly emerge from complexity, then perhaps it belongs to the very foundation of reality itself. And this is where a very old idea returns, not loudly, not as a claim to be proven, but as a quiet possibility that has echoed across centuries. It can be expressed in just a few simple words: all is mind. At first, this may feel abstract, even distant, but if you approach it gently, it begins to take on a different kind of meaning. You might start by noticing something simple. Everything you have ever known about the universe has come to you through experience. Every star you have seen, every sound you have heard, every idea you have considered, all of it has appeared within awareness, not outside it. Even the concept of a vast objective universe exists for you as something experienced. This does not mean the universe is only inside your personal mind, but it does suggest something subtle. That experience is not just a small part of reality. It is the only way reality ever becomes known. And so, some have wondered, what if this is not just a feature of human perception, but a clue about the nature of reality itself? You might imagine a dream. While you're inside it, the dream feels real. The landscape stretches outward, objects appear solid, events unfold with a sense of continuity, and yet everything in that dream arises from a single source, not separate pieces scattered in space, but expressions of one underlying process. When you wake, you realize that what felt like an external world was, in some sense, a projection of mind. Now, this does not mean that waking reality is simply a dream, but the comparison can be helpful, because it shows how a complex structured world can arise within a unified field of experience. And so the question gently returns: what if the universe itself is something like that? Not an illusion, not unreal, but an expression, a manifestation, something that appears as matter, energy, and space, but is, at a deeper level, rooted in something more like experience. You might picture it as a vast ocean. On the surface there are waves, rising, falling, interacting. Each wave has its own shape, its own movement, its own identity. But all of them are made of the same water. And beneath the surface there is a continuous, unified depth. If you focus only on the waves, the ocean appears divided. But if you look more deeply, the separation begins to dissolve, and perhaps, in a similar way, what we call objects, planets, stars, bodies, are like waves, temporary forms, patterns that emerge, interact, and fade, while the underlying reality remains continuous. In this view, mind is not something that appears within the universe. It is something the universe appears within. Not your personal thoughts, not your individual identity, but something broader, something that gives rise to experience itself. This idea has taken many forms across history, sometimes described as a universal consciousness, sometimes as an infinite intelligence, sometimes simply as the ground of being. But the essence remains similar, that the universe at its deepest level is not made of lifeless matter, but of something that has the capacity for experience, Of course, this is not something we can easily test. It is not a theory in the same way that physics describes motion or energy. It is a perspective, a way of seeing, and like all perspectives, it reveals certain things while leaving others in shadow. You might notice that this idea does not remove the physical world. It does not deny atoms, forces, or interactions. Instead, it gently reframes them as appearances, as expressions, as ways in which something deeper becomes visible. You can still describe the motion of planets. You can still measure energy. You can still explore the structure of matter. But alongside those descriptions, there is another question. What is it that allows any of this to be experienced at all? And rather than answering that question directly, this perspective suggests that experience itself is not something added later. It is already there, at the foundation, like a quiet presence, always there, but often unnoticed. And as you sit here, listening, you might begin to sense something similar. That awareness is not something you are actively creating. It is simply there, holding everything together. Thoughts come and go, sounds appear and fade, ideas rise and settle, but the awareness that contains them remains unchanged, steady, and perhaps, just perhaps, that quiet awareness is not entirely separate from the universe you are exploring, but is, in some subtle way, continuous with it. Not something inside it, not something outside it, but part of the same unfolding. And from here, another ancient idea begins to emerge, one that suggests that the patterns we see in the world around us may reflect the patterns within our own mind, as if the small and the large are quietly mirroring each other. As the idea of all is mind gently settles, another ancient insight begins to take shape. It is a simple phrase, quiet, almost poetic. As above, so below. At first, it may sound like a metaphor, something symbolic, perhaps even abstract. But if you sit with it for a moment, it begins to feel like a way of noticing patterns, a way of seeing how different levels of reality might reflect one another. You might begin with something very familiar, a drop of water falling into a still pond. It creates ripples, small circles spreading outward, each one echoing the last. Now, imagine looking at that same pattern from a greater distance. Waves in the ocean, rolling in long rhythmic lines, different in scale, but similar in form. Or think of the branching of a tree, from trunk to branch to smaller branches to leaves. Then compare it to the structure of a river system, a main current, dividing into smaller streams, then into even finer pathways. Again, different in scale, but quietly related, the same pattern, repeating. And this is the essence of the idea, that the small and the large are not entirely separate, that what we observe in one domain may echo in another, not perfectly, but meaningfully. This way of thinking is often associated with a tradition known as Hermetic philosophy, but rather than focusing on the name, you can simply feel the intuition behind it, that reality is not made of isolated layers, but of patterns that reappear across different levels. And if that is the case, then something interesting begins to happen. Because earlier we explored the idea that consciousness might be connected to integration, to the way parts come together into a unified whole. And now, through this lens, we begin to wonder, could that same principle exist at different scales? You might notice how your own thoughts work. A single idea appears, then it connects to another, then another. Gradually a pattern forms, a narrative, a sense of coherence. Your mind gathers fragments and weaves them into something meaningful. Now step back, look at a group of people, each with their own thoughts, their own perspectives, and yet, through communication, shared understanding begins to form. Ideas spread, cultures develop, collective patterns emerge, not from a single mind, but from many interacting minds, and then step back again to ecosystems, to planetary systems, to galaxies, structures forming, interacting, stabilizing, patterns emerging from connection. And so, a quiet possibility arises that the way your thoughts come together may not be entirely unique, that it may reflect a more general principle, one that operates throughout the universe, not because the universe is thinking in the same way you are, but because the process of integration, of forming unity from parts, is fundamental. You might imagine standing between two mirrors, one facing the other, reflections extending into the distance, each image containing a smaller version of the whole, not identical, but related. And in that repeating structure, something becomes visible, a kind of coherence, a sense that the same underlying pattern is expressing itself in different ways. This does not mean that your mind controls the universe, or that the universe is simply a projection of your thoughts, but it suggests something more subtle, that both may arise from the same kind of process, that the patterns within your awareness and the patterns within the cosmos may share a common structure. And this brings us gently back to the idea of mind, not as a personal identity, not as a stream of thoughts tied to a single body, but as a process, a way that information organizes itself into meaningful wholes, a way that fragments become unified. And if this process exists at many levels, then perhaps your own awareness is not an isolated event, but part of a larger continuity, a small expression of something more expansive. You might think of it like a single ripple in a vast ocean, distinct, yes, but still connected to the larger movement, still shaped by the same underlying dynamics. And as you notice your own experience, thoughts arising, fading, connecting, you may begin to sense this pattern more clearly, not as an idea to analyze, but as something to observe, the way a feeling leads to a thought leads to another, and gradually a moment takes shape, a quiet coherence forming out of many small parts, and perhaps in a similar way, the universe itself unfolds, not as a collection of disconnected events, but as a continuous process of relationship and reflection, where the small mirrors the large, and the large, in some subtle way, echoes the small. Of course, this is not a proof. It is not something we can measure directly, but it is a way of seeing, a lens, one that invites you to notice connections where you might have seen separation before. And as this idea gently settles, another question begins to emerge. If patterns repeat across scales, if the structure of mind and the structure of the universe share something in common, then what role does your own awareness play? Is it simply observing these patterns, or is it participating in them? And as that question lingers, we begin to turn inward again, toward the quiet space where thoughts arise, where perception takes shape, where experience itself begins to unfold. As the idea of reflection settles, of patterns echoing across scales, the focus begins to shift once more, not outward, but inward, toward something closer, something you can notice not by looking at the star, but by simply paying attention, your own experience. Right now, as you listen, there is a quiet field of awareness. Sounds are entering it, words are forming, ideas are unfolding, and yet something even more subtle is happening. Your mind is not just receiving these words, it is shaping them, interpreting them, giving them meaning. You might notice that the same sentence spoken to two different people can feel entirely different. One may hear comfort, another may hear confusion. The words are the same, but the experience changes. And this is because the mind is not a passive observer. It is active, quietly, constantly, shaping what is perceived. You can explore this gently. Imagine recalling a memory, perhaps something simple, a place you once visited. At first, the image may appear faint. Then, as you focus, details begin to fill in, colours deepen, sounds emerge, the scene becomes more vivid, and yet, nothing external has changed. The environment around you is the same. What changed is the activity within your mind. It assembled fragments, visual impressions, sensations, associations, and wove them into a coherent experience, almost like constructing a small world from within. Now imagine shifting that memory slightly, changing the lighting, altering the mood. What was once calm might feel tense. What was once distant might feel close. Again, the outer world remains unchanged, but your experience transforms, and so, quietly, you begin to see something important. That what you experience is not just what is out there, it is also how your mind engages with it, filters it, shapes it. You might think of it like looking through tinted glass. The world beyond the glass exists, but the colour you perceive depends on the lens, or like listening to music through different speakers. The melody is the same, but the tone, the depth, the feeling shifts. And so the mind becomes something like a laboratory, not in the sense of instruments and measurements, but as a space where experience is continuously formed, where input and interpretation meet, where perception becomes reality for you. And this is not a rare occurrence. It is happening all the time. When you interpret a facial expression, when you anticipate a sound, when you imagine something that has not yet happened. The mind is constantly blending what is present with what is expected, and in doing so, it creates the world you live in, not entirely from scratch, but not entirely from outside either, a collaboration between what is given and how it is received. This idea has been explored in many different ways. In psychology, it appears as the understanding that perception is constructed. In neuroscience, it is seen in the brain's tendency to predict, to fill in gaps, to organize sensory input into meaningful patterns. But you don't need the technical details to sense it. You can observe it directly. A shadow in a dim room can feel like something more until you look closely. A familiar song can bring back emotions, even before the lyrics begin. A simple thought can change your entire mood. All of this points to the same quiet principle. That experience is not fixed, it is shaped. And if your own experience of reality is shaped in this way, it invites a deeper question. What if reality itself works similarly? Not in the sense that your individual thoughts control the universe, but in the sense that what we call reality may depend, in part, on how it is observed, how it is engaged with, how it becomes known. Earlier, we touched on the idea that systems may have different degrees of integration, different levels of inner unity, and now, from the perspective of your own mind, you can feel what that unity is like. A single, continuous field of awareness, not fragmented, not scattered, but whole. And within that wholeness, everything you experience appears. Thoughts, sensations, memories, each one arising, interacting, fading. And yet the awareness itself remains steady, like a quiet background, unchanging, even as everything within it moves. And so a gentle connection begins to form between the inner and the outer, between your own awareness and the larger patterns we have been exploring. If your mind can shape experience, if it can bring coherence to fragments, if it can turn scattered inputs into a unified moment, then perhaps this process is not unique to you. Perhaps it reflects something more general, a way that reality organises itself, a way that the many become one. And if that is the case, then the boundary between observer and observed begins to soften, not disappearing completely, but becoming less rigid, more fluid, as if the act of experiencing is not separate from the unfolding of reality, but part of it. And from here, another layer of the mystery begins to emerge, because if experience is shaped through interaction, if perception and reality are not entirely independent, then what happens at the smallest scales, where observation itself seems to play a role, where possibilities shift depending on how they are encountered? And so, gently, we return to the physical world, not to leave these ideas behind, but to see how they might echo even there. As the quiet activity of your own mind lingers, shaping experience, weaving meaning, we begin to turn back toward the outer world, but now perhaps with slightly different eyes. Because earlier we saw that perception is not simply received, it is formed. And so, when we look again at the smallest layer of reality, something familiar begins to echo. At everyday scales, objects feel solid. A table is here. A cup is there. Things seem to have clear positions, clear properties. But when scientists began to look more closely, far beyond what the eye can see, they discovered something unexpected. At very small scales, the world does not behave like a collection of tiny, well-defined objects. Instead, it behaves more like a range of possibilities. Imagine a coin spinning in the air. While it spins, you cannot say it is heads or tails. It holds both possibilities. Only when it lands does one outcome appear. Now, this is only an analogy, but it gently points towards something deeper. At the smallest levels, before an interaction takes place, systems can exist in multiple possible states at once. Not in the sense of confusion, but in the sense of openness. A range of ways things could be. And then, when something interacts with them, when a measurement is made, one of those possibilities becomes definite. A particular outcome appears. This is sometimes described in technical language, but you can feel it more simply, as if reality at its deepest level is not fully fixed in advance, but becomes more defined through interaction. You might picture a soft mist in the early morning. Shapes are present, but not yet clear. Then, as the light shifts, forms begin to emerge, edges sharpen, details appear. What was once vague becomes distinct. In a similar way, these tiny systems seem to move from possibility into clarity. And this process has puzzled scientists for a long time, because it raises a subtle question. What exactly causes this shift? What brings a range of possibilities into a single, definite outcome? There are many ways to approach this question. Some explanations focus on interaction itself. When a system interacts with its surroundings, when it becomes part of a larger process, the range of possibilities narrows and a stable outcome emerges. No observer is required in the everyday sense, only interaction, only connection. And this aligns in a gentle way with what we have been exploring, that systems do not exist in isolation, that relationships matter, that reality takes shape through interaction. But even with this understanding, something remains quietly intriguing, because in describing these processes we often use words like observation, measurement, or record. And while these do not necessarily mean a conscious observer, they still point to a moment when something becomes defined, when something becomes, in a sense, known, not necessarily by a mind, but within the structure of reality itself. And this invites a soft reflection. If reality becomes more definite through interaction, if possibilities settle into outcomes, then the universe is not simply a fixed structure unfolding like a script. It is something more dynamic, more open, a process that continuously moves from potential into form. You might imagine a piece of music again. Before it is played, the melody exists as a possibility, notes written on a page, patterns waiting to be heard. But only when the music is performed do those possibilities become sound, a specific sequence, a lived experience, and in that moment, the abstract becomes real. Not because it changed in essence, but because it was expressed. In a similar way, the universe at its smaller scale seems to hold possibilities, and then express them through interaction. Now, it is important to remain gentle here. This does not mean that consciousness creates reality. It does not mean that your thoughts control physical events. Physics remains careful, grounded, precise. But what it does suggest is that reality is not entirely independent of how it is engaged with, that the act of interaction plays a role in how things become defined. And when we place this alongside what we explored earlier, the idea that experience is shaped, that integration matters, that connection is fundamental, a quiet pattern begins to emerge, not a conclusion, but a resonance, a sense that, at many levels, reality is not simply there in a fixed final form, but is something that unfolds, something that becomes, gradually, through relationship. And as you sit here, listening, your own experience reflects this process. Words arrive, they take shape, meanings form, not all at once, but step by step. Possibility becoming clarity, thought becoming understanding, and then gently dissolving again. And from this perspective, the boundary between the physical world and experience feels just a little less rigid, not erased, but softened, as if both are part of the same unfolding process. And from here, another question begins to arise. If reality becomes more defined through interaction, then what role does the observer truly play? Not necessarily a human observer, but any system that participates in this process. What does it mean to observe, to interact, to bring something into clarity? And as that question lingers, we move a little deeper into the nature of observation itself. Time equals quote 3 seconds quote / greater than. As the idea of possibility settling into form continues to unfold, it brings us to a word that often feels familiar, yet quietly misunderstood. Observation. In everyday life, to observe means to look, to notice, to be aware of something. But in the language of physics, the meaning is softer and at the same time more subtle. It does not necessarily require a person. It does not require awareness. Instead, it refers to something simpler, an interaction, a moment when a system becomes connected to something else, and in doing so, leaves a trace. You might imagine placing your hand gently on a still surface of water. The moment your fingers touch it, ripples spread outward. The surface changes. A record has been made, not written in words, but in movement. In the same way, when a tiny system, like a particle, interacts with its surroundings, it leaves a kind of imprint. Its state becomes linked to the environment. And through that linkage, certain possibilities fade while others become more stable. You don't need to picture equations or symbols. You can simply imagine a delicate situation becoming gradually more settled. Earlier we spoke of a spinning coin, holding multiple possibilities at once. Now imagine that coin landing on a soft surface. The motion slows, the outcome stabilizes, heads or tails. Not because someone watched it, but because the interaction itself brought it to rest. In physics, this process is sometimes described with a term that sounds technical, but can be felt intuitively. It is often called decoherence. But you can think of it more gently, as the fading of possibilities. When a system is isolated, its possibilities remain open, but as it interacts with the surrounding world, those possibilities begin to interfere, overlap, and eventually settle into patterns that appear stable. Not because something mysterious forced them to choose, but because the system is no longer alone. It is part of a larger whole, and within that larger whole, certain outcomes become consistent, repeatable, observable. You might picture a drop of ink falling into clear water. At first, the drop is distinct. Its boundaries are sharp, but as it spreads, it blends into the surrounding liquid. The original form becomes harder to isolate. The system becomes more connected, more integrated with its environment, and in that integration, the clarity of separate possibilities fades. A stable pattern emerges, and so the idea of observation becomes less about watching and more about participation, less about awareness and more about interaction. This distinction is important because it gently corrects a common misunderstanding, the idea that consciousness is required to create reality, that without a mind observing, nothing becomes real. Physics does not require that conclusion. Instead, it suggests something more subtle, that reality becomes defined through interaction, whether or not a conscious observer is present. And yet, even with this clarification, something interesting remains. Because although interaction does not require consciousness, consciousness itself is a form of interaction, a very particular kind. When you become aware of something, your mind is interacting with it, not physically in the same way particles interact, but informationally. You are taking in patterns, forming representations, creating meaning. And so, while consciousness may not be necessary for reality to unfold, it is still deeply connected to the way reality becomes known. You might think of it like light entering a room. The room exists in the dark. Its structure is already there. But when light enters, the details become visible, not created, but revealed. And in that sense, awareness plays a role, not as the cause of existence, but as the condition for experience. This distinction allows us to move forward more carefully, without overstating, without assuming more than the evidence allows, and yet still leaving space for wonder, because even if consciousness does not create reality, it still occupies a unique position within it. It is the place where the universe becomes visible to itself, not necessarily in a cosmic sense, but in a local, immediate way, through you, through your experience, and so the picture becomes more nuanced. Reality unfolds through interaction, systems connect, exchange, stabilize, and within that unfolding, some systems, like your brain, develop the ability to represent those interactions internally, to model them, to reflect on them. And this reflection is what we call awareness, not separate from reality, but part of its process, a way in which reality becomes meaningful. And from here, a deeper question begins to form. If interaction defines reality at the smallest scales, and awareness reflects that reality at larger scales, then is there a deeper relationship between the two? Not a direct cause, but a shared structure, a common pattern. And this question brings us to a perspective that gently bridges science and philosophy, an idea that suggests we're not merely passive observers of a finished universe, but participants in its unfolding, not because we control it, but because we are part of the same process. And as that idea begins to take shape, we move toward one of the most intriguing reflections of this possibility. As the idea of interaction settles and the distinction between observing and participating begins to soften, another perspective quietly comes into view. one that does not claim certainty, but invites a different way of seeing. It comes from a physicist named John Archibald Wheeler, who spent much of his life thinking about the deeper meaning of the universe, and over time he arrived at a thought that feels, at first, almost surprising, that the universe is not simply a finished structure, waiting to be observed, but something that, in a subtle way, becomes more defined through participation, not just human participation, but the participation of any system that interacts, records, and brings about definite outcomes. You might begin to sense this idea by returning to something familiar, a photograph. Before a photograph is taken, a moment exists, but it is fleeting, unfixed, unrecorded. But when the camera captures it, something changes. The moment becomes stable, defined, a part of history, not created from nothing, but brought into clarity. Now imagine extending this idea, gently, across the entire universe, not as a literal photograph, but as a continuous process. Events unfolding, possibilities narrowing, outcomes becoming definite. And within this process, systems that interact with those events help shape how they become defined, not by controlling them, but by participating in their unfolding. Wheeler described this in a poetic way. He suggested that we are not just observers of the universe, but participants in bringing it into being, not in the sense that we create the universe from nothing, but in the sense that the universe at its deepest level may not be fully complete until it is engaged with, until it becomes part of a network of interactions, until it is, in some way, registered. You might imagine a vast unfinished painting. The outlines are there, the colours are present, but the details are not fully defined. Then, as brush strokes are added through interaction, through observation, the image becomes clearer, more specific, more real. Again, this is not a literal process, but a way of sensing the idea. That reality may not be entirely fixed in advance, but is shaped, in part, by how it unfolds through interaction. And this leads to what Wheeler called a participatory view of the universe, a perspective in which existence is not completely separate from the processes that reveal it, where the act of observation, understood as interaction, plays a role in how reality becomes definite. Now, it is important to remain gentle here. This does not mean that the universe depends on human consciousness to exist. Stars formed long before life appeared. Galaxies evolved without any observers in the human sense, but it suggests something more subtle, that the universe, at its deepest level, is not a static object, but a dynamic process, one in which definition arises through participation, through interaction, through the continuous exchange of information. You might think of it like a story. Before it is read, the words are there, the structure exists, but the meaning, the lived experience of the story, only comes into being when it is engaged with, when it is read, when it is experienced. And in that sense, the reader is not creating the story, but is participating in its unfolding. In a similar way, Wheeler's idea invites us to see the universe not as something entirely separate from us, but as something we are part of, not as distant observers looking in, but as participants within the same process. And this brings us to a quiet, almost poetic realization that the awareness you're experiencing right now may not be an isolated phenomenon, but part of the way the universe becomes known, not in a grand cosmic sense, but in a local, immediate one, through your perception, through your experience, through this very moment. You might notice that everything you're aware of exists for you as something experienced. The sound of these words, the feeling of your body resting, the subtle movement of your thoughts, all of it arises within awareness, and so, in a very direct way, the universe as you know it exists through experience, not because experience creates it entirely, but because experience is how it becomes present. And this leads to a gentle shift in perspective, from seeing yourself as a small part of a vast indifferent universe, to seeing yourself as part of the process through which the universe becomes visible, not separate, not outside, but involved, connected, participating. Of course, this idea remains open. It is not something we can confirm in a final sense. It is not a conclusion, but a way of looking, a lens, and like all lenses, it highlights certain aspects while leaving others less clear. But even as a possibility, it carries a certain quiet depth, because it suggests that existence is not just something that happens, but something that unfolds in relation, that the universe is not only something to be observed, but something that, in a subtle way, includes the act of observation within its structure. And as you sit here, listening, you may begin to feel that relationship, not as a concept, but as a quiet sense of connection between your awareness and the world it reveals. And from here, the journey continues into an even older way of seeing, one that speaks not of particles or interactions, but of shadows and forms and the deeper patterns that lie beneath what we perceive. As the idea of participation gently fades into the background, another way of seeing begins to emerge, not from modern science, but from a much earlier time, a time when questions about reality were asked not with instruments, but with quiet reflection. One of the thinkers who explored this was Plato, and rather than offering a technical explanation, he told a story, a simple one. You can imagine it now. A group of people sitting in a cave. They've been there for as long as they can remember, facing a wall. Behind them, unseen, there's a fire, and between the fire and the people, objects pass by. As those objects move, they cast shadows onto the wall in front of them, and for those sitting there, the shadows are everything. They see shapes shifting, figures moving, patterns appearing and disappearing, and because they have never seen anything else, they believe those shadows are real, not representations, not reflections, but reality itself. You might pause here and let the image settle. A quiet cave, flickering light, shadows dancing across a wall. Now imagine that one person, slowly, gently, begins to turn around. At first, the light feels overwhelming, unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but as their eyes adjust, they begin to see what was always there, the fire, the objects, the source of the shadows. And in that moment, something shifts. What once seemed real now feels incomplete, not false, but partial, a surface, a projection of something deeper. This story is often called the cave allegory, but you don't need the name. You can feel its meaning, because it reflects something very close to your own experience. Every day you move through a world of appearances, colours, shapes, sounds, textures. They feel solid, immediate, certain, and yet all of them are filtered through perception, through the way your mind organises and presents what is out there. You never experience the world directly, only the version of it that appears within awareness, and so, in a gentle way, you are always sitting in a kind of cave, not trapped, but positioned, seeing the world as it appears, rather than as it might be in itself. This does not mean that reality is an illusion. The shadows in the cave were not nothing. They were connected to something real, but they were not the whole story. They were expressions, representations, and this invites a quiet question. What if the world you experience is something like that? Not false, not unreal, but a surface, a reflection of deeper structures that you do not directly perceive. You might notice how this idea connects to what we explored earlier. That experience is shaped, that perception is filtered, that reality, as it appears to you, is not simply given, but constructed. And now, through this story, we see a similar pattern, a distinction between appearance and underlying form. You can imagine looking at your reflection in a mirror. The image is clear, recognizable, but it is not you. It is a representation, a surface expression of something deeper, and yet, if you had never seen anything else, you might believe that reflection was all there is. In the same way, Plato's story suggests that what we perceive may be only a reflection of a deeper reality, not something separate, but something more fundamental, something that gives rise to what we see, without being fully visible itself. This idea doesn't require us to reject the physical world. You can still touch objects, still observe patterns, still explore the universe through science, but it gently adds another layer, a reminder that what appears may not be the full picture, and that understanding reality may require more than observing surfaces. It may require a shift in perspective, a turning, not necessarily away from the world, but deeper into it. You might even notice that this process has already begun within you. As you listen, as you reflect, as you question, you are in a small way turning around, not physically, but mentally, looking beyond immediate appearances toward the structures that might lie beneath. And this turning is not abrupt, it is gradual, soft, like your eyes adjusting to light after being in darkness. At first, things feel unclear. Then, slowly, shapes begin to form, and in that quiet adjustment, a new way of seeing becomes possible, not replacing what came before, but expanding it, allowing you to hold both perspectives at once, the surface and the depth, the shadow and the source. And from here, the story continues. Because if what we perceive is only a reflection, then what is it a reflection of? What lies beyond the wall of shadows? What deeper structure gives rise to the world we experience? And as that question gently forms, we begin to explore another idea from the same tradition, one that suggests that beneath change in appearances, there may be something unchanging, something constant, something that the mind, in its own quiet way, may already recognize. As the image of the cave slowly fades, and the idea of shadows giving way to something deeper begins to settle, another quiet question emerges. If what we perceive is only a surface, then what lies beneath it? What is it that these appearances reflect? In the same tradition as the story of the cave, Plato offered a gentle way of approaching this question. He suggested that beyond the changing world we experience, beyond shifting shapes, fleeting moments, and temporary forms, there may exist something more stable, something unchanging, not something you can touch or see directly, but something the mind can recognize. To sense this idea, you don't need to think in abstract terms. You can begin with something simple, a circle. If you draw one on paper, it will never be perfect. The line may be slightly uneven, the shape may be a little distorted, and yet, when you look at it, you still recognize it as a circle, not because the drawing is flawless, but because you already have a sense of what a circle is. Somewhere within your understanding there exists an idea of a perfect circle, not drawn, not seen with your eyes, but known in a quiet, intuitive way. And this raises a subtle possibility that what you recognize in the world is not learned entirely from the outside, but is in some sense already present within you, not in detail, not as complete knowledge, but as a kind of familiarity, a sense of recognition. You might notice this when you hear a melody for the first time, and yet it feels strangely familiar. or when you encounter an idea that resonates deeply, as if you've always known it, even though you've just discovered it. There is a quiet feeling of remembering, not recalling a specific moment, but reconnecting with something that feels already understood. Plato suggested that this feeling points towards something deeper, that the mind is not simply building knowledge from scratch, but uncovering it, recognizing patterns that exist beyond the changing surface of the world. In his view, what we see around us, objects, events, forms, are not the ultimate reality. They are expressions, imperfect reflections of something more fundamental, something that does not change. You might imagine it like looking at reflections in water. The shapes ripple, distort, shift with every movement, but the object being reflected remains stable, unchanging. And so, what we perceive may be like those reflections, dynamic, fluid, always in motion, while the deeper structure remains steady beneath it. Now, this idea does not ask you to reject the physical world. It does not suggest that what you experience is meaningless. Instead, it gently invites you to see it differently, as something that points beyond itself, as something that hints at deeper patterns, rather than containing them entirely. And in this way, knowledge becomes less about gathering information and more about recognition, about tuning into something that already resonates within you. You might think of it like adjusting a radio. At first there is static, noise, unclear signals. But as you slowly turn the dial, a clear tone emerges. Not because the sound was created in that moment, but because you aligned with it. And perhaps in a similar way, understanding reality is not about constructing it from pieces, but about aligning with deeper structures, becoming sensitive to patterns that are always present, but not always obvious. This perspective also offers a gentle bridge to what we've been exploring throughout this journey. The idea that consciousness may not be something added at the end, but something connected to the very structure of reality. If the mind can recognize deeper patterns, if it can access something beyond immediate appearance, then perhaps it is not entirely separate from what it perceives. Perhaps it is part of the same underlying process, a way in which those deeper patterns become known, not perfectly, not completely, but partially, gradually, like light slowly revealing the shape of a landscape. And this brings us to a quiet and subtle possibility. That awareness is not only observing the world, but participating in its unfolding by recognizing it, by bringing patterns into clarity, by making sense of what might otherwise remain unseen, not by creating those patterns from nothing, but by meeting them, by resonating with them. And as you sit here, listening, you might notice that this process is already happening. Ideas are forming, connections are being made, something within you is recognizing, understanding, even if only gently, and that recognition feels less like building something new, and more like uncovering something that was already there, a quiet familiarity, a sense of knowing, without needing to force it. And from here, the journey begins to turn once more, not back to ancient philosophy, but toward your own experience again, because if what we perceive is shaped by the mind, and if the mind can recognize deeper patterns, then a new question begins to emerge. What is the nature of the reality we experience? Is it something entirely outside us, or something that is, in part, shaped from within? And as that question settles, we move toward the edge of understanding, where science, perception, and experience begin to meet. As the sense of recognition gently lingers, as if something within you has been quietly aligning with these ideas, the focus shifts once more, not outward, not backward, but inward, into the nature of experience itself. Because if what we perceive may be a reflection, and if the mind plays a role in recognizing deeper patterns, then a simple but profound question begins to take shape. Where is reality exactly? Is it entirely out there, existing independently, complete and fixed, waiting to be observed? Or is it, at least in part, something that forms within experience? You might begin by noticing something very ordinary: vision. When you look around, it feels as though you are seeing the world directly. Objects appear solid, colours seem to belong to things, space feels continuous and stable, but what is actually happening is more subtle. Light reflects off objects, enters your eyes, and is transformed into signals. Those signals travel into the brain, where they are organised, interpreted, and assembled into a coherent image. What you experience is not the raw world itself, but a constructed representation, a model, not false, but filtered. You might think of it like looking through a window made of gently tinted glass. The landscape outside is real, but the colour you perceive depends on the glass. Or like listening to a song through headphones, the music exists, but what you hear is shaped by the device, the environment, and your own attention. In the same way, your experience of reality is shaped by the way your mind processes information. It fills in gaps, it smooths out inconsistencies, it organises patterns into meaningful forms, and most of the time this process is so seamless that you never notice it happening. The world simply feels as it is. But there are moments when the process becomes visible. You might have experienced this in a dimly lit room, when a shadow briefly appears as something else, a shape that seems familiar or even unsettling. And then, when you look more closely, it resolves. The interpretation shifts. Nothing in the external world changed, only your perception did. Or consider how quickly you can recognize a face in a crowd. Even when the details are unclear, your mind fills in what is missing. It completes the pattern, and in doing so, it creates a stable experience from incomplete information. These small moments reveal something important. That perception is not a passive recording. It is an active process, a collaboration between what is present and how it is interpreted. And this idea has been explored deeply in modern science, not in a heavy or technical way, but in a way that gently suggests that the brain is constantly predicting, organising, and refining what it perceives. You might imagine it like a quiet conversation between expectation and input. The mind anticipates what might be there, and then adjusts based on what actually arrives, over and over, smoothly, effortlessly, until a coherent world emerges. And so, reality, as you experience it, is not just something that exists independently. It is something that takes shape within awareness, not entirely created, but not entirely received either. A blending, a meeting point. And this raises a deeper question. If all of your experience of the universe arises within awareness, then what does it mean to say that reality is out there? Of course, there is something beyond perception. The world does not vanish when you close your eyes, but what you know of that world is always mediated through experience, always shaped, always filtered, and so the boundary between the external and the internal becomes less clear, not disappearing completely, but softening, like a horizon that seems sharp from a distance, but blurs as you approach it. You might begin to sense that what you call reality is not a single, fixed layer, but a relationship between the world and the way it is experienced. And within that relationship, your mind plays a quiet but essential role, not as a creator of everything, but as a participant in how everything appears. And this connects, in a gentle way, to everything we have explored so far. The idea that systems integrate information, that connection shapes structure, that observation involves interaction, that awareness reflects deeper patterns. All of these threads begin to weave together, forming a picture that is not rigid, but fluid, a reality that is not entirely fixed, but continuously unfolding through interaction and perception. And as you sit here, listening, you can notice this unfolding directly. The sound of these words, the meaning they carry, the way your thoughts respond, shift, settle, all of it happening within awareness, not separate from it. And from this perspective, the question changes. It is no longer simply, what is reality made of? But also, how does reality become what it is in experience? And as that question gently rests, another layer begins to open, one that touches something even more familiar: time, the sense of past, present, and future, the flow that seems to carry everything forward, and yet may not be as simple as it appears. As the question of reality gently lingers, another dimension begins to come into focus, not something you can see directly, not something you can hold, but something you feel constantly. Time. It seems so simple at first, a steady flow, moments passing, one after another, the past behind you, the future ahead, and the present, slipping quietly between them. But if you sit with it for a moment, the feeling begins to change, because time, as you experience it, is not always steady. There are moments that seem to stretch, waiting in silence. A single minute can feel long, almost suspended. And then there are moments that pass so quickly, you barely notice them at all. A conversation, a memory, a dream, gone, almost as soon as they appear. And yet, the clock moves the same way, second by second, tick by tick. So which one is time, the measured rhythm, or the felt experience? Perhaps both, or perhaps something more subtle. In physics, time is often described as part of the structure of the universe itself, not separate from space, but woven together with it, a kind of fabric, flexible, not rigid, sensitive to motion and to gravity. You don't need to imagine equations to sense this. You can think of it more gently. Imagine two people, one standing still, the other moving very, very fast. From their own perspectives, time feels normal, but compared to each other, something shifts. The moving person's time passes just a little more slowly, not enough to notice in everyday life, but measurable, real, and similarly near something very massive, like a star or a planet. Time flows differently, more slowly compared to regions farther away, as if time itself bends slightly under the presence of mass. This may sound distant, abstract, but it reveals something important. That time is not the same everywhere. It is not absolute. It changes, depending on conditions, and when you place this alongside your own experience, another layer appears, because your sense of time also changes, not because of speed or gravity, but because of attention, emotion, state of mind. In moments of calm, time can feel spacious, open. In moments of stress, it can feel compressed, rushed. In dreams, time behaves in even stranger ways. A long story can unfold in what seems like only a few moments. Events can jump, shift, rearrange, and yet while you are inside the dream, it feels real, consistent, complete. Only when you wake do you notice how fluid it was, and this invites a quiet reflection. That time, as you experience it, is not simply something that exists outside you. It is something that arises within awareness, shaped by perception, organized by the mind. You might think of it like a flowing river. From the outside, the river moves steadily, but from within, the experience of the flow depends on where you are, standing still on the bank or moving along with the current. And so, time becomes both a physical process and an experiential one, measured and felt, objective and subjective. And when we bring these layers together, something interesting begins to emerge, that the structure of reality as described by physics and the structure of experience as lived through awareness are not entirely separate. They reflect each other in subtle ways, both flexible, both dependent on context, both shaped by relationships, and this opens the door to another area of exploration, one that moves beyond everyday waking experience into altered states of consciousness, moments when perception shifts and the usual boundaries soften. You might have experienced this in deep meditation, when thoughts slow and time seems to dissolve, minutes passing without a clear sense of duration, or in the moments just before sleep, when images drift and the sense of sequence begins to blur, or even in creative flow, when you become so absorbed in something that time seems to disappear entirely. In all of these states, something changes, not in the external world, but in the way experience is organized, and time, once again, reveals its fluid nature, not fixed, but shaped. And this leads to a gentle possibility. That time, like perception, is not simply a property of the universe, but also a feature of how the universe is experienced, not separate from awareness, but intertwined with it. Of course, this does not mean that time is only an illusion. The physical processes remain, clocks continue to move, events unfold. But it suggests that what we call time may have layers, a physical layer, an experiential layer, and perhaps deeper layers still, layers that we do not yet fully understand. And as you sit here, listening, you may notice your own sense of time shifting slightly. The pace of these words, the rhythm of thought, the gentle unfolding of ideas, not rushed, not fixed, but flowing. And in that flow, something becomes clear. That reality is not just made of things, but of processes, of change, of becoming, and time is the thread that seems to carry it all. Or perhaps the way we experience that thread, and from here, the journey begins to slow, not because the questions are answered, but because they deepen. Because the more we explore, the more we sense how much remains unknown, and this leads us gently to the edge, where understanding gives way to wonder. As the sense of time begins to soften, and the flow of ideas gently slows, we arrive at a place that feels less like an ending, and more like a quiet pause. Not a conclusion, but a space, a place where questions are allowed to remain without needing to be resolved. Because throughout this journey, we have moved through many different ways of seeing. We began with the universe itself, a vast unfolding, from energy to structure, from structure to life, from life to awareness, a long, continuous process that somehow led to this moment, to you listening. Then we asked whether consciousness is simply a result of complexity, or something more fundamental, whether it appeared suddenly or has been present in quieter forms all along. We explored the idea that systems become more unified as their parts connect. That awareness may be linked not to specific materials, but to patterns of integration. We looked at the smallest scales, where particles behave less like objects and more like possibilities, where interaction brings clarity and separation becomes less certain. We considered the possibility that the universe is not entirely fixed, but unfolds, gradually, through relationship. And then we stepped into older perspectives, Ideas that suggest reality may be more than what appears on the surface, that what we perceive may be reflections, shadows, expressions of something deeper. We explored the idea that the mind is not only observing the world, but shaping the way it is experienced. That perception is not passive, but active. That reality, as you know it, arises within awareness, as much as it exists beyond it. And finally, we touched on time, that quiet thread that seems to carry everything forward, and yet shifts depending on how it is felt, expanding, contracting, blurring at the edges. All of these ideas, different in language, different in origin, but gently pointing towards something similar. That reality may not be as simple as it appears, not fully objective, not fully subjective, but something that emerges at the intersection between structure and experience, between what is and how it is known. And so, we arrive at a question that does not demand an answer, only attention. Is consciousness something that the universe produces? Or is it something the universe is expressing? Is the mind a small, isolated phenomenon, or part of a larger continuity? Is reality something that exists entirely outside us, or something that unfolds, at least in part, within awareness? Perhaps it is one, perhaps the other, or perhaps something else entirely. Something that does not fit easily into the categories we have created, and it is here, in this quiet uncertainty, that something unexpected happens. The need for certainty begins to fade, not because the questions are unimportant, but because they open into something wider, a sense of wonder, a feeling that reality is not something to be fully captured, but something to be experienced, explored, gently approached. You might notice in this moment that awareness itself is still present, unchanged, holding everything together, the thoughts that have passed, the images that have formed, the questions that remain, all appearing and dissolving within it, and that awareness does not seem to belong to any single idea. It is simply there, quiet, steady, like a background that never quite leaves. And perhaps, just perhaps, that quiet awareness is not separate from the universe we have been exploring, but part of it, a small window through which the universe becomes visible, not in its entirety, but in a way that is immediate and real. And so, rather than closing this journey with an answer, we leave it open, not unfinished, but ongoing, like a path that continues beyond what we can see. You don't need to resolve these ideas. You don't need to decide what is true. You can simply let them rest, like distant stars, present, but not demanding attention. And as you settle into this quiet space, you may begin to notice something even more subtle, that the mystery itself is not something outside you. It is something you are already part of, not separate from, not observing from a distance, but participating in, simply by being aware. And so we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open, or you're already drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming. Thank you for being part of this quiet journey. If you'd like to return for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome. And if someone you know could use a peaceful pause, you might share this with them. For now, you can let everything soften, let the questions fade, let the thoughts settle. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to solve, only the soft presence of awareness and the gentle hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.